So today our speaker is John Randolph from the History Department at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And his talk is called Cheaper the Better, Enlightenment, Empire, and Russia's 19th Century. And our subsidnik is Olga Maiorova from the University of Michigan, Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures, also affiliated with the History Department there. And I'm particularly excited because this talk takes up some of the issues with which we opened 19B in spring of 2020, meaning what was the 19th century in Russia? How do we think of it? How do we periodize it? How do we imagine that time? So it's very fitting that we're opening this year's seminar series with this topic. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you very much, Anne, for that introduction. Thank you to Sasha and Sarah for organizing this event, and to the Jordan Center for hosting it, and to all of you for attending it. It's really an honor for me to have a chance to present this to all of you and to see so many wonderful scholars gathered in this room today. Like I said, I'm very grateful for the chance to present at 19B today, and I have been really interested to follow the many important questions, among them the ones that Anne just summarized, that the seminar has raised, including what defines the 19th century in Russia, what would be the value of such a periodization, what should be the relationship between history and literary history, or indeed between historical and literary studies in Russian studies today, between scholars working in Russia and scholars working outside of Russia. What should be the role in both of classical corpora and archival research, of conceptual theorists and empiricist commentators. Today, I'd like to add my 2 cents to that discussion, based on my work on the history of postal communications, and more specifically, the labor obligations that supported them. Have a slight revision to the talk, which will maybe help clarify its emphasis a little bit. It's called The Cheaper the Better Obligation Culture in Russia's 19th Century. With your indulgence, I'd like to do a little comparative historiographical reflection on how historians think about the relationship between free and unfree labor, a little analysis of one kind of 19th century cultural performance, the so-called coachman song, iamshchchitskaia pesn'ia. But before I get to either of those, I'd like to set the scene with a little anecdote. So at the dawn of the 19th century, right after the coup that brought him to power, Alexander I ordered his government to consider how best to reform the Russian Empire's postal service. Now, the history of communication tends to be a kind of Whiggish affair, focused on functional improvements over time. And so you might think that Alexander charged his committee with functional questions like how to improve the transportation of people, things, and information, or how to expand the size of the postal network, or how to make it faster, or how to make it more reliable, how to introduce new forms of service. Not so, actually. The emperor's charge to the committee centered not on how the posts functioned, but how they were moored in society, and in particular on the question of who bore their costs. Now, at this time, under locally specific obligations, pesn'ia, populations across the empire were required to support the empire's posts and its thousands of relay stations, something like 3,200 in 1802, providing drivers, horses, wagons, supplies, and money for the upkeep of these stations, and labor, of course. And Alexander ordered his committee to investigate these foundations and to draft for him the most convenient and equalizing statute for its, that is, the post's support. He believed that at that time, a social group, a specific social group called iamshchchitskaia, or relay coachmen, were a hereditary caste defined by their service to the post. And in his charge to the committee, he said again that they should consider what was the most convenient and equalizing method for maintaining the posts. But he also gave them one specific limitation for their discussions. He said that I consider the estate of relay coachmen necessary for the greatest convenience in this matter, and that their transfer into the general station of state peasants would be harmful. For several years then, the Special Committee, then the Imperial Senate, and then eventually the August Permanent Council worked on this problem, gathering detailed information on the empire's existing system of postal obligations and considering alternatives to it. In the end, the majority coalesced around the opinion that the empire's current practice of relay obligation needed to be transformed along commercial lines so that the post users paid for its costs. Thus, in 1806, Admiral Pavel Chichagov told the Permanent Council that, quote, the only principle on which postal matters may be durably founded is the conversion of postal obligation into a fee for transportation and delivery. Here, however, Alexander's direct order to maintain a permanently and particularly obligated estate of relay coachmen posed a sizable obstacle to any such plan. The emperor had asked them to find the, quote, most equalizing way of creating communications in the empire, and yet simultaneously asserted that a necessary and convenient way of doing things was to maintain the practice of obligating all of these burdens on a specific social group. Many of his advisors were skeptical. To them, Russia's relay coachmen seemed like an archaic holdover rather than a convenient mark of an advancing civilization. Thus, Count Victor Kochubey wrote, I think that if today, when Russia in its enlightenment approaches that of other states, we decided to make our postal system anew, then of course no one would even think about creating our estate of relay coachmen, whose first origins we find in that Russia which was still uneducated. To this way of thinking then, the relationship between obligation and civilization in Russia was stadial, or perhaps accidental. Uneducated Russia had created one way of communication, rooted in unequal obligations. Russia had subsequently risen to some enlightenment, but nonetheless retained this archaic system as a new century dawned. An opposing view, however, was offered by Senator Osip Kazadavlev, eventually the Minister of Internal Affairs and also the head of Russia's posts. Ripping a page from Rousseau's second discourse on the origins and foundations of inequality among mankind, Kazadavlev argued that the making of Russia's enlightenment actually had demanded on increasing such obligations. In the beginning, in the deep history, although interestingly, Kazadavlev did not say exactly when this was, it was necessary to establish a post that could carry the government's decrees, letters, packages, and people from one place to another. The cheaper, the better. Establishing such a post using free labor or private postmasters on a contract basis or by some other such means was not possible. It would have been too expensive for those who have to travel by post or have something to send. And for that reason, they took peasants from the land and farmers were made drivers and relay coachmen. Across many sectors of civilization, Kazadavlev argued, obligation and culture had a reciprocal and not stadial relationship in Russia, with the growth of one leading to the growth of another. The question facing the new 19th century would be, could this reciprocal relationship be transformed so that culture did not depend on obligation? And if it could, what would happen with the old forms of civilization rooted in imperial corvées, such as the supposed estate of relay coachmen, whom no one would even think of creating today? So here I'd like to pause for a moment for a little historiographical reflection. For what it's worth, it seems important to me to note that modern historians of free and unfree labor internationally are also increasingly inclined to think like Rousseauians and have been calling for scholars to, quote, explore the relation between free and unfree labor as part of reciprocal rather than stadial history. Free labor arguably did not exist at all until the 19th century in the sense of the master-servant contract being enshrined in civil rather than criminal law, the editors of the Cambridge World History of Slavery concluded recently. Rather than trying to track the evolution from one form of labor into another across time or space, historians have tended to focus on two interacting questions. One, how did extra economic forms of labor compulsion relate to the emergence and conditions of wage labor within any one time? So synchronically rather than diachronically. And two, what role, on the other hand, do conceptions and I would argue performances of free and unfree labor play in the making of the social imaginary. Now, under the first heading, 1, I imagine most of us will recall some version of the debate on capitalism and slavery, which focuses on the degree to which unfree labor in colonies creates commodities or wealth to support industrial waged free labor elsewhere. But setting aside that hotly debated hypothesis, I'd also like to note that within imperial labor histories, scholars are increasingly focusing on the ways in which state obligations, above all actually in the reproductive labor of transport, themselves create markets for waged labor. Community production for a market was not the only factor driving the transformation of labor itself into a commodity. John Donahue and Evelyn Dennings conclude in their recent collection on imperial labor history in the British Empire. And this identifies a pattern to which I'll return in the Russian case in a moment, the role of the state in creating what we might call, quote, an economy of services, that is, the sale and resale of the job of fulfilling imperial corvées and performing obligations. When we turn to the roles played by free and unfree labor in the production of social imaginaries, meanwhile, we are likely to think first in semiotic terms, I guess specifically in our Russia field, of the two as mutually constitutive opposing binaries symbolically, through which, for example, notions of freedom are imagined against conceptions of bondage. Free people become visible by contrast to slaves, quotes around both. Yuri Lotman famously posited an imperial Russian semiosphere framed by persistent contrast between the theatrical daily life of the emancipated, educated nobility and the bonded byt of ordinary people. Orlando Patterson employs a similar approach in his classic Freedom in the Making of Western Culture. Yet what about the meanings and artifacts produced not so much by the scripts or the symbolic system as by the performances of obligation? What sort of contexts, what sort of texts were produced for the making of culture when people showed themselves doing the work of empire? Alongside the theater of distinction created around noble freedom, or the elaborate scenarios of power that the Romanov dynasty enacted to project its authority, might we also investigate the theater of obligation that played out in the commonest of spaces? What work might that do in our scholarship? Now, I recognize I have gone off on a bit of a theoretical tangent, so let me now get back to the business of 19V and the subject of my talk. Let me start with the question, what defines a 19th century in Russia? A caveat, since I'm a historian, if asked what defines the 19th century in Russia, of course, my first reaction is going to be to try to situate it in larger historical understandings, which, as both Luba Goldberg and Polly Blakesley and others in earlier episodes of 19V have noted, is not the only time frame and perhaps should even be resisted in favor of non-linear, syncopated centuries or poetic time, or letting loose of the notion of periods altogether, to which I can truly only say yes. That said, if we do want to operate on the marches between literature and history and want to ask what defines the 19th century in Russia, then I think we should also ask what, if anything, defines the 19th century within the history of Russian empire. The weight of historical research in the last 3 decades, after all, has extended the imperial period back 2 centuries, from the 18th century to the early 16th century, and focused on how Moscow's dynasties used an enduring repertoire of imperial techniques to build imperial authority and imperial civilization across a gigantic space. What kind of break does the 19th century offer in this process? I opened with the controversies facing Alexander's Postal Committee, because it seems to me that its theme of the transformation of obligations offers one answer, and I just want to say one out of many, to this question. From its earliest beginnings, after all, empire entered people's lives as a demand to do something, to swear an oath of loyalty, to pay a tax in money or kind, to collect and deliver taxes, to build roads, to build fortresses, to transport the empire's possessions and personnel, to serve in the army, to harvest the wealth of forests, to work to produce surplus in the fields in support of all of the above. The differential assignment of these obligations and ameliorating privileges through a vast variety of separate deals has been regarded by many recent scholars, of course, as a foundational practice by which the empire built not only power, but managed and mobilized societies through the encouragement of hierarchy and difference. The first part of Alexander's charge to his committee signaled, with conscious gestures to the dawning of a new century, that maybe that time was now changing. Was it possible to build imperial communications through some single equalizing statute, reducing the number of special deals and broadening out the base of obligation to the point that it no longer seems so much like a particular form of subjecthood, but perhaps something like a universal civic duty? At least some of Alexander's elite advisors replied that not only was it possible, but that actually it would be more enlightened. And that the best way of all was to transport obligations through commercial means and free labor, rather than relying on the performance of relay obligations by, as they supposed, the empire's existing bespoke estate of relay coachmen. Now, we all know that such liberal beginnings were not consistently followed during Alexander's reign or at any other point across the 19th century. And as I mentioned, Alexander himself immediately threw a wrench in this whole process by demanding a kind of cutout for the estate of relay coachmen. And in the event, 5 more postal committees meeting until the 1840s deliberated on this very question before any decision was taken to eliminate relay obligation in the Russian Empire. So rather than describing this particular debate as some breakthrough or some particular moment where everything changes, I would, following this kind of social intellectual history advanced by Jonathan Israel about the Enlightenment, instead call it a kind of controversy that played out across Russian life in the proverbial halls of power, but also in civilian drawing rooms, and indeed out on the road in the middle of nowhere across the 19th century. The fault lines of this discourse, its organizing distinctions between free and unfree labor, its competing conceptions of the propriety and economy of relying on imperial obligations, the continuing questions of what to do with those aspects of imperial civilization that seem defined by them, are visible across the 19th century, transnationally, but also in Russia. Most obviously in our Russian case, I think we know this through studies of politics and finance, such as the century-long controversy over whether and how to transform imperial taxation traced by Yanni Katsonis here at New York University in States of Obligation, or Yekaterina Pravilova's analysis of 19th century attempts to extract a res publica or public property out of the empire's territory, previously forged by autocratic grants of privilege and corresponding demands for service. Even more obviously, perhaps, we might think about the several interacting peasant emancipations, or perhaps more accurately, the transformation of peasant obligations, quite often by their financialization across the 19th century, both before and after 1861, as the meat and bones of this controversy and the place where it played out both bureaucratically and publicly. But rather than reviewing the political or institutional side of obligations transformation in the 19th century, I'd like to take the rest of my time to shift gears a little bit to consider its involvement in literary and artistic processes and the creation of one of the 19th century's most distinctive and enduring performative genres, the folkloristic commonplace known as the coachman's song, iamshchchitskaia pesn'ia. In a world where people were already actively discussing the transformation of previous imperial practices of obligation and the culture that was produced by them, what did various publics make of the traces of their performance? So the coachman's song occupies an important but somewhat mysterious place in modern Russian culture. Starting in the 1820s, imperial Russian poets and composers collaborated in the creation of this art song genre, which in the century and a half since has allowed thousands, maybe millions actually, of trained and not so trained singers to perform life on Russia's relay roads and the heartbreak of Russian coachmen. A song that is called There the Bold Troika Speeds, Votchitsa Troika Udalaya, published to popular success in urban Russia by the composer Alexei Verstovsky under the title Kolokolchik, the Bell, in the late 1820s, is generally understood to have helped launch this genre. In the decades that followed, it swelled to a tradition involving scores of titles, reproduced and reinvented in popular songbooks, pesn'ia, until the revolution and beyond. It includes such hits as "Вот на пути село большое," there's a big village on the way, "Pesn'ia," the coachman's song, "Однозвучно гремит колокольчик," the little bell rings in unison, "Тройка мчится, тройка скачет," the troika speeds and bounds, "Звенит звонок и тройка мчится," a bell chimes and the troika speeds, "Когда я на почте служил ямщиком," when I served the post as a coachman, "Вот мчится тройка почтовая," there speeds a postal troika, and many others. You can see some of the names on this recent anthology. Grown flexible over time to almost any voice or venue, these songs are broken out whenever a real Russian song is needed, on philharmonic stages and at pop concerts and karaoke bars, in homes, at bivouac, on YouTube. Nor should it be said, has the genre been limited by national or linguistic boundaries. Already in the late 1830s, for example, a British actress named Josephine Clark sang it in memorized phonetic Russian to the visiting Prince Pyotr Vyazemsky while he was vacationing on the English coast. And at Illinois, I have a colleague who remembers being taught them in the 1980s as a school child in Japan. Meanwhile, in Russia itself, they are regularly presented as folk songs, presumed to lack original lyricists or composers, and whose origins are lost in the sands of time. That's not true, but this is only one of the confusions surrounding the history of the coachman song. For one thing, the name itself is misleading. Though the notion may seem fantastic, we do in fact have broad testimony that Russian relay coachmen iamshchiki sang while driving their horses. The phenomenon of the singing coachman is thus not a tradition invented by later romantics out of whole cloth, but was actually part of the performance of relay obligation. I have an actual essay on this in the recent volume, Russian Performances. Yet Russian coachmen, when they sang, did not sing this genre, this art song genre, the coachman song. Their repertoire, which precedes the art song genre by decades, seems to have been made up by a combination of rural peasant song and its typical pesn'ia, pлясовые, fast, slow variants, and perhaps more importantly, the new urban ballad form known as the Russian song, русская песня, российская песня, which despite its name was not so much an ethnic or national genre, but a variant of the international culture of popular song, in which new melodramatic songs about duty and desire, and here a hat tip to Hilde Hugeboom, who talked about that theme in 19V at the end of last year, were mapped onto well-known but modern melodies and sung in various places. Coachman songs, by contrast, began as music written for performance in salons and musical theaters, vaudeville preeminently, with arrangements for piano, harp, and guitar by authors and composers whose names can certainly be known, even if the song's subsequent popularity has sometimes made them seem timeless. They often contain within them the ventriloquized song of a coachman, and I'll illustrate this in a moment, but usually, as in the case of their speed, the bold troika, usually they start at some remove in the third person to take in the scene of the coaching life from the point of view of an outside observer, a traveler, society, I don't know, God. Rather than being the songs that coachmen sang, these end up being songs about coachmen singing. Rather, more precisely, these are songs about the experience of observing, of being the audience of a coachman who is singing. They transport us into the performative culture of Russia's relay roads, encouraging us to imagine we are part of the lonely intimacy of a relay troika and to partake of the artistry that unfolds there. They even quite often encourage us to take on the dual role of performers ourselves, first to create the stage in our song, and then to ventriloquize the voices of singing coachmen. Widely regarded and name-checked as the prototype of the genre, Their Speed's The Bold Troika can be used as an example of it here. So I have the lyrics up here right now. Although I don't have time to go into the whole story right now, they were not written by the folk, but rather initially by the soldier poet Fyodor Glinka, and then adapted by performers, and then by the vaudeville and opera composer Alexei Verostovsky, who placed it to music famously in 1828. Glinka actually had intended these particular lyrics to be part of a three-part poem called Son Ruskого na chuzbinie, the dream of a Russian in a foreign land. But instead, what happened when it was extracted as a coachman song was specifically this scene and this scene alone. So the three parts of a Russian's dream abroad are, one of them takes place in the city, one of them takes place in the village, and then there's kind of this middle moment or moment of transport between those two places. And when it became a song, this middle moment was specifically the part that was extracted. All right, to remind you of the genre and give you a chance to consider it, I'm just going to play a performance of it here for you while you have a chance to look at the lyrics.
Iamshchitskaia повстал с ночи, ему взгрустнуло в тиши, и он запел на ясные очи про очи девицы души, про очи девицы души. Вы очи, очи голубые, вы сокрушили молодцов. Зачем люди злые? Вы их разрознили сердца. Вы их разрознили сердца.
All right, so that was a performance by this the Soviet opera singer Valentin Levko. As you can see, the lyrics here fall, very broadly speaking, into two halves. The first part, as I said, sets a scene. So, we're in a landscape. And then the second part, the coachman begins to sing. I zapel moj yamshchik, or yamshchik, I on zapel pro yasne ochi. This is a very typical kind of moment in all of these songs, the moment where the coachman begins to sing. Now, although the version of the music I played for you, unfortunately, shows 20th century elements, such as the overlay of a folky balalaika line, as composed, Verostovsky's music is arranged for salon instruments, a guitar, a piano, a harp, and as you can hear, relies on a classically trained singer, such as in Josephine's case, which could very often, as in Josephine's case, be a woman who then sings its bouncing line. Standing, as it were, before a room of literary scholars and scholars of Russian culture, I'd love to have your thoughts about how to interpret this text, or perhaps more exactly, the performance it invites us to do. To first imagine ourselves on the open road in a troika, and then to sing out with the heartbroken lament of a man whose task it is to drive it. The first thing I would observe is that this is, in micro, almost literally a script for performing obligation, for showing and inviting us to play that role. What is the joy? What is the work done by that act? Setting that interpretive question aside for later, let me turn to the question of how societies have understood the genesis of this genre. How should we write its history? Scholarship on the coachman song, of which actually there's a fair amount, tends to fall into one of three patterns. One opinion is kind of what I'll call the ethnographic hypothesis. That namely, the coachman song is simply a logical extension of the songs of Russian coachmen and emerges essentially from the conditions of labor. And so thus, for example, one scholar writing in Soviet times wrote, "Быть ямщиков и бурлаков породил лирические, ямщицкие и бурlatские песни." So again, "быть," the category of everyday life, creates this genre. More generally, though, the task of historicizing these songs has fallen to musicologists specializing in classical music. And they have often, as in the case of Richard Taruskin, articulated what I might call a national musicological version of this, that the coachman song is the result of a project whose goal was to, quote, make the products of oral tradition available to the literate by allowing the music of the countryside to reach the piano parlor. And indeed, in practice today, this genre can typically be found on the marches between many performative versions of modern Russian national culture, between folklorism and folklore, between the popular stage estrada and the classical stage, between camp and the quest for authenticity. A third and final approach has been blazed by literary scholars who have explored the ways in which the coachman song achieves and attempts to meet what might be thought of as a romantic aesthetic objective. Yuri Lotman argues in the analysis of poetic texts that the aesthetics of the Enlightenment were based on a constant contrast and imagination of humanity's flight from a, quote, world of slavery into a, quote, world of freedom. Romanticism, he continued, by contrast, also holds out freedom as the normative ideal direction, but simultaneously embraces the principled openness of the road. And in his invaluable study of Russian art song, Thomas Hodge notes that in this respect, the coachman song plays a very important role. It kind of embodies this state of conveyance between the points of destination from the world of freedom, from the world of obligation into the world of freedom. And in that sense is a classical example of how literary romanticism imagined, in Russian terms, a critical, open, but often difficult point in the modern hero's existence. Now, each of these approaches generates insights which can help us understand the creation of the coachman's song as a performative genre of the 19th century, a way of showing oneself doing the work of participating in modern culture. Yet none of them, I think, grapple with the imperial institutional context surrounding the coachman's song. This is, I think, in part because the making of modern culture in Imperial Russia has often been understood in terms of a dynamic interplay between a popular, authentic everyday life, rooted in conservative tradition, and a more theatrical culture of elite ambition for national and artistic self-invention. Against such a backdrop, the phenomenon of singing coachman all too easily becomes yet another phenomenon of everyday life, which culture makers, poets and composers, draw on as inspiration as they pursue their cultural projects. The nature of this buit and its relationship to the development of the coachman song, meanwhile, remains hazy. It is taken, for example, as a given, that the everyday life in question is that of a caste, soslovia, of relay coachmen, a specific social group defined by a set of obligations and occupations within the empire. This is certainly what early 19th century statesmen often believed was true about iamshchitskaia. Yet as the detailed census of the obligation prepared by Alexander's own postal committee showed, relay obligations were spread broadly across census society in the late 18th and early 19th century, even as the caste of relay coachmen, that is, the populations of Yemskaya Slobody, stagnated and declined. Increasingly, communities collected taxes and hired laborers to perform obligations in their stead, an economy of service that developed particularly rapidly as the network expanded in the period 1780 to 1840. In this sense, the culture of relay singing was not the culture of a caste, but the culture of everyday people hired into the performance of an imperial obligation, of serving the post as coachman, sluzhit yamshikom, to borrow the words of the famous song. In other words, well before art song writers like Versovsky adapted this kind of performance to the salon, singing was part of how people hired to fulfill obligations performed that role. So it was already a performative genre. Born within an economy of service, a part of a financial transformation of relay obligation in the Russian Empire that was occurring in society well in advance of definitive state action, long hung up in committee, this particular form of performance also drew strength from developments in consumer culture. During the first quarter of the 19th century, significantly, people did not only take an interest in performing coachman's songs, they also began to produce and buy and display artifacts associated with relay service. Probably the first example along these lines I'd like to bring up is the industry of harness bells, so-called подужные колокольчики, or often known actually as yemskие колокольчики, that respectable townspeople and richer peasants began to import onto their own troikas in the early 19th century. The shaft bow, or duga, is the wooden arch that curls over the central horse of a troika. And this form of harness was used in Russia from ancient times. Yet in the 1770s, the government ordered Catherine's government ordered that a small bell of this kind be hung under the duga harness of a relay troika to serve as kind of a siren. In other words, it was a bell that would alert people to give right of way to the passage of these imperial transports. Partially, maybe it was also to scare off like bandits or bears. And then also it was meant to be heard from afar to sort of signal that a relay troika was incoming. The need for such bells greatly stimulated their production in the late 18th century. And according to the assiduous research of bell collectors and ethnographers, this particular form of bell became an important craft industry in sort of northwestern Russia, again in the 1780s, 1790s. Some of the earliest dated bells that we have of this form date from the early 1800s. The earliest one actually is from 1802. And one of the things that's remarkable about these bells is that they contain inscriptions on what's called the yubka, the skirt of the bell, the bottom of the bell, which sort of alerts us to the purpose of these particular things. And here you can see some of these inscriptions. Кто сей подарок покупает, а он его веселяет, мастер аха, who buys this gift will be amused by it. This bell made in Valdai, кого люблю, того и дарю, I'll give it to the one I love. Купи денег, не жалей, со мной ездить веселее. Buy me, don't be stingy, driving's more fun with me. I guess I'm loosely translating this here, but you can get the sense. Oriented towards the buyer, these inscriptions cast the bells as a purchase with a purpose, something that one could buy to give or to buy to enjoy oneself. But in any case, buy with the knowledge that one is acquiring a good with a date and a master maker, a fine thing to own. So in many ways, these are literally kind of shards from the performance of relay obligation that people are buying and building into their transports. And interestingly, there's an interplay here with the art song genre. You'll notice that one of the key features that is being advertised here, as in this first inscription, is the idea that these kolokolchiki can be podarkia, right? They're gifts, right? If we go back to Vovchitsa Udalaya, Glinka actually created out of this what ultimately became one of the key cliches of the coachman song, this notion that the bell, kolokolchik, is the dar Valdaya. Now, when we read that, we might think it's Valdai's gift in a kind of romantic sense. This is like the Geist of Valdai, the spirit of Valdai that is being expressed to kolokolchik. But actually, another thing that's being played with here is that these are actually padarkia. So the evolution of a kind of a literal gift coming out of consumer culture into a kind of romantic transformation as being something that is kind of the spirit of the land is an interesting process that we can begin to observe. All right. So that's one element of what I would call the consumer culture or the consumer cult around relay obligation in the early 19th century. The other one that I would mention, and just sort of let you look at some of these images, is the incredibly rich pictorial tradition around this. In the late 18 teens, early 1820s, lithography arrived in Russia. And when people began to think, okay, what are we gonna use this new tool for? Portraying scenes from the coaching life was one of the preferred selected images. And in fact, the innovative Alexander Orlovsky, who's kind of considered one of the key pioneers of lithography in Russia, which was meant to be a popular medium, chose scenes from the coaching life to great acclaim. One reviewer wrote of this particular scene from Orlovsky, for example, "What liveliness, how natural. You hear the sound of the bell and the hoofbeats of the horses, the shouts of the driver who has, it seems, the word for official use, pokazyonne nadobnostia, written in bold across his bow," one journalist remarked. As can be seen, an appreciation of the imperial dimensions of this situation, the fact that the troika in question is in the state's service, does not prevent the reviewer's pleasure in the picaresque quality of Russian postal driving and pride that it has finally been captured and precisely presented. In the realm of song, material and consumer culture, and vernacular print then, the artistry surrounding an imperial obligation had become an object of civilian consumption and performance, affecting a juncture between this continuing imperial technique and the production of modern culture. And here are just a couple more images. This is kind of a riff on one of Orlovsky's lithographs that's also popular. This one is from actually before Orlovsky. This is an engraving by the French artist Damam Dumatray. And this, meanwhile, is actually a lithograph from the middle of the 19th century. But what this is actually a Lubok that's been transported into the realm of lithography by the very famous printers' families of Gavrilovs in Moscow in the 1850s and 1860s. And then a song text of one of these coachman songs is placed at the bottom. All right. Oh, and here's just another such example. All right, I've talked for a long time and tried to stitch a number of themes together, and it's no doubt time to stop, and I will. But let me try to summarize a few of my themes and hypotheses in conclusion by returning to this picture with which I started this presentation. So in the late 1830s, Emperor Nicholas I personally approved this drawing as a model for the new winter uniform for relay coachmen on the Dunaburg-Daugavpils postal road in his empire's Polish-Lithuanian borderlands. So this is the winter uniform, and this is the summer uniform. There was also a summer equivalent. With their heavy black kaftans tied with a sash and lovely tall hats crowned with an imperial double-headed eagle, these costumes embody an idealized version of what the estate of relay coachmen was supposed to be in Russia. A traditional-looking, beard-wearing, patriarchal, masculine service class, plebeian in origin, but trained and devoted to a particular form of service. There are many ironies around these images, however. On the one hand, the Dunaburg Road had no such estate of relay coachmen, ever. Nicholas loved that road, in fact, because since the 18th century, it was run by a system of private contractors who ran the posts with hired labor for profit, some of which profit they returned to the Russian government. Giving these costumes to those Polish-Lithuanian post riders was to dress them up as a Russian imperial service class, hereditarily obliged to serve the posts, even as they themselves were actually hired laborers. Meanwhile, turning his eyes to the empire's other relay roads, Nicholas was actually busy precisely at this time signing a different order. His new order specified that the commercial model used on the Dunaburg Road should be generalized to the empire as a whole. The actual caste of relay coachmen, which by that time was finally understood to be only a small minority of the people in relay service, was thereafter slated for dissolution, its members incorporated into the empire's state peasantry, its service to be paid for by a combination of user fees and broad social taxes. Here we see the interaction of two themes I've tried to describe in my talk as I think distinctly characteristic of the 19th century. On the one hand, the continuing transformation of obligations and the search for new ways of situating imperial services in society. And on the other hand, the ways in which images of this older service order circulated as social types to be variously performed, reused, and tried on. Thank you very much.
John, thank you very much for that fascinating talk. Olga, I hand it over to you.
I would like to begin, just like John, I would like to begin by thanking the organizers of the 19V talk series for creating this extraordinary forum that has been bringing us together for discussions for more than a year. I also want to thank Sarah Dickinson and the other organizers for inviting me to comment on John's paper. I'm grateful for this opportunity to read and think about John's fascinating work. In my brief comments, I will try to highlight what I find the most significant and revealing in this paper. So the paper is so rich, I cannot touch upon many of its aspects. But as I articulate my comments, I will also try to pose some questions for John, though I should admit that it was hard for me to wake up my skeptical self while reading this beautiful paper. The wide range of sources and the intellectual sharpness with which they are processed make for such a convincing discussion in John's paper that it's difficult to resist its charm and ask questions. Yet today it's my job to comment and question, and I will try to live up to my task. How often do social historians talk to those who research popular songs? And how often do specialists in labor studies engage in textual analysis of poetry? John's paper puts these very different fields of inquiry into an intense and productive conversation to generate very original contribution that explores the coachman's song emergence, pesn'ia, in the historical context of the postal service, imperial practices of obligation, and the rise of free wage labor. Of course, every work on intellectual or cultural history engages with a broader historical context that might include that of social or labor history. But this paper is special, unique in my view, in the sense that it not only places the coachman songs in the context of labor history, the paper does much more. It offers its own primary and empirical research in both fields, cultural and social history, or intellectual and social history. And the link between the two fields can be illuminated by what John has called a performance of work obligations. Methodologically, this notion builds on Lotman's study of the semiosphere and his theory of the theatrical daily life of the educated nobility, as John acknowledged. But John's study also resists the semiotic approach. It resists the binary opposition between noble rituals and the ordinary life of the lower classes by introducing the notion of a theater of obligation that played out in the life of the common people, or in the commonest spaces, as John puts it. Much as Richard Wortman's scenarios of power enacted Tsarist authority, John's theater of labor or performance of obligations played an important role in producing the experience of ordinary life for the Russian people or for the Russian audience. I consider this notion of a performance of obligations a profound breakthrough, which both historians and literary scholars can find productive and exciting. As John shows, these performances of obligations generated new meanings and artifacts, including coachman's songs. More broadly, they generated the social imaginary that pervaded many cultural expressions in the 19th century and beyond. John traces this development by showing how Verstovsky and many others who followed him in their coachman songs focused on the theater of the relay service. But here is my first question. If the court ceremonies enacted the power of the ruling dynasty, as we know from the seminal work of Richard Wortman, and if the imperial theater of distinction reassured the status of the nobility, managed and mobilized societies, as we know from recent studies of the empire, what was the social and symbolic role of the theater of labor of the common people in the communist spaces? And how did this theater of labor fit into the issues of paid and unpaid labor that you discussed so deeply in the first part of your paper and interpret as a controversy that played out across Russian life. How is this controversy played out in the theater of the relay service? As I was reading your paper, I felt that at some points you did allude to possible answers to the question. But it will be very helpful if you address them more explicitly, address these questions more explicitly. And of course, my first kind of impulse is to say, oh, that's how the link between through these performances of labor performed in the educated society, that's how the link between various strata of society was built and the nation was imagined. But I see that you avoid such a maybe simple or simplistic explanation. So I would like to think a little bit more about the symbolic role of this theater of labor. I find very engaging your discussion of theories about paid and unpaid labor existing synchronically. You mentioned that historians of the transatlantic world see a metropoly as a site for free labor and a colony as a site for extra economic forms of labor compulsion. And you beautifully show how different the situation was in Russia proper, where unpaid and paid labor existed well. When unpaid labor existed well into the mid-19th century and itself created markets for wage labor. My question, however, is this: how was this postal service organized in Russia's borderlands, which were non-ethnically Russian? Who implemented it and who paid for it? You do say that populations across the empire were required to support the post's relay stations as their state obligation, but then you mentioned that the Dynaburg postal service in the Polish-Lithuanian borderlands functioned on a contractual basis and thus radically different from the postal service in Russia proper. So it is important, I think, to address the issue of how the postal service was organized in Russia's borderlands or colonies. How did it work in the other parts of the empire? And this leads me to wonder, was the yamshchik always a Russian guy? The cultural expressions and the artifacts that you discuss obviously suggest an affirmative answer. But some clarifications would be helpful. And I think about many visual representations of yamshchiks, and they are of various ethnic origins. The yamshchik is a powerful figure in the 19th century cultural and social imagination. Mobility, speed, loneliness, a voice singing in the endless spaces, the indeterminacy of travel across such huge country, all these aspects of his labor gave the figure gave a figure a wide range of cultural connotations from the age of Romanticism, as you mentioned, well into the 20th century. People in this audience will recall many fictional yamshchiks. I will mention only my favorite one, Balaga, an intrepid guy who appears in just one episode in War and Peace. He arrives in Moscow to help Kuragin steal away Natasha Rostova, but he receives almost a one-page description. Not many cameo characters in the novel get so much space. And this itself reveals the significance of this figure. I'm sure my colleagues can recall many ямщиks featured in Gogol, Turgenev, Kuprin, and other writers. And from this literary perspective, I will ask my concluding questions. Is it a coincidence that Verstovsky's Coachman song emerged in the 1820s at the same time the folk song genre was being reinforced by a group of the so-called self-taught, presumably peasant poets who embodied in their lives and in their poems, of course, the romantic idea of people's poet, народный поэт. Could it be that ямщик played a similar role in the poetry as a kind of народный поэт, singing in the poem, whose songs is embedded into the into the poems of professional writers? Who did the genre? How did the genre of emergence pesn'ia evolve? It's my second question, and the reading of the songs that you listed suggested some evolution to again emphasizing some more national connotations, broad national connotations, and the vision of the nation. How should we interpret the multiple ямщиks in literature who do not sing at all? I understand that it's not your topic. You are talking about the emergence pesn'ia, but it's puzzling that there are so many ямщиks in literature that are not singing, and I'm wondering what brought this group of the ямщиks. Was this, I mean, the non-singing ямщиks, a radical break with the conventional image of ямщик, constructed during the Romantic time? And finally, literature sometimes featured women performing the traditional masculine labor. And I can mention Leonid Trefalev's poem «Таинственный ямщик». And of course, this таинственный ямщик turns out to be a woman. As a historian, have you found any records supporting the existence of female ямщиks? And my final question, and it's not even a question, it's a brief comment. In 1787, Nikolai Lvov's comic opera, «Ямщики на подставе», was staged. So, and all the ямщиks sang their songs there. Of course, it was a comic opera. So, and this example of Lvov's opera actually questions whether or not the emergence pesn'ia was produced in the Romantic age. I would see it as beginning in the age of the Enlightenment, and of course with the Romanticism changing lots of perceptions. Thank you very much, and once again, wonderful experience. Thanks.
Olga, thank you for those remarks.
Yeah.
John, I'll turn it over back to you, and then after you have a chance to respond, we can open it to questions.
So Olga, thank you so much for your kind comments and questions. And I tried to copy them down, and I created a mess on my paper. So
I will send them to you.
I hope I will get to at least some of them here. So actually, maybe I'll start with I'll try to go in order. So one question, this question of the theater of obligation. One thing that I think is quite interesting and distinctive, and maybe tries to get at how I'm trying to imagine this concept, is that although we have very elaborate scripts for scenarios of power, right? That is a very elaborate archive of scenarios of power. Actually, to my knowledge at least, and I'd be very curious what, we obviously have a lot of historians, a lot of scholars here, but the scripts by which people were supposed to perform labor services were not that elaborate. So in other words, it wasn't always described exactly how people were supposed to do specific tasks. And for example, I guess for me, it's kind of interesting that, for example, this notion of singing, there's no imperial law that prescribes that people are supposed to sing while driving relay coaches, right? That's not a scenario that is put out there. It just seems to have become a practice that somehow developed, right? And I in the Russian performances essay and in my book manuscript, I have a kind of chapter about that. But I think one of the things for how that came about is that while you're performing this obligated labor, for which remuneration is very small, it's pretty clear that tipping is actually is at least a part of what's going on. And many of the texts allude to the idea that one of the roles of the yamshchik is to entertain the person that is riding. So singing is also possibly a kind of play for the traveler more than the state, as it were, and with the perhaps orientation of receiving some sort of gratuity or at least better treatment by these people than by the state. So I guess the first thing is when we think about its role in the symbolic order or the kind of meanings that are generated out of this, although there are interesting parallels to some of Lotman's conceptions or the scenarios of power, there are also some differences in terms of how these things get scripted and what meanings are generated by people's performance of them. One of the things you asked is, how does this manifest a controversy over freedom, over obligation, free, unfree labor, right? I think, from my point of view, part of it is, again, this question of what is the work that is done when somebody voluntarily takes on a part of this culture of performance and does it themselves. So I'm trying to imagine, for example, when Josephine Clark in 1830, or before her, women, say, in salons in the 1820s and 1830s, are out there embodying, very briefly, but nonetheless embodying the yamshchik and the voice of the yamshchik as part of their cultural attainments. I think it gets to, in some ways, it's just broad melodramatic context that Hildy Hogenboom was talking about at the end of last semester, the sort of question of the conflict of duty and desire in society and the way in which people feel that in their lives and perhaps can have moments of breaking through to express that in their performances. So I think, for me, that's part of the work of this. I'd be curious what other people think. So it's not it's kind of a controversy. I mean, it's kind of a meditation. I mean, sometimes it's an explicit controversy, like in political documents. These coachman songs are not like, should this be organized according to commercial principles, or should this be a state of relay coachman, right? But it's participating in this kind of discussion of the relative strengths and placement of freedom and unfreedom in society. So that's, I guess, one thing I would think about. And when I say theater of obligation, I guess it's not exactly it's more just, again, this question of kind of when people are working, it's not necessarily just a reflection of Buit, but it's actually also a reflection of imperial relations, and how those imperial relations have meaning within culture is kind of the question, one of the questions I'm trying to think about. In terms of borderlands, yes. So, I mean, I would say the Russian Empire in general expected all subject peoples to participate in the maintenance of imperial communications. The establishment of Yemskia Slobody, or special settlements for this, was one way of doing it, which Muscovy brought out of its 16th and 17th centuries. But it did, I would not say the government cared necessarily exactly how people did it, and it was very happy to have separate deals and separate arrangements. And so, for example, the Duneburg Road, I think that's just a case of the as you know, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is incorporated into the Russian Empire agreeing to use the existing system, which was modeled in part on the Turn and Taxis system in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was a commercial system of farmed out monopolies. This was very common throughout the kind of history of postal communications in early modern Europe. It was very happy to just sort of take on that system and throw upon it the business of delivering officials and mail. So not necessarily messing around with the social relations, but just expecting the system as it existed to have taxes. In, for example, the Volga, in places where you had the Yasak system, where you had like, you know, relations of tribute between peoples in the state, you would have performance of relay obligation by so-called Yasashny Lyudya. And this would be as part of their tribute to the Russian state. So in different places at different points in time, this obligation was fulfilled in different ways. Although I would say that in the early 19th century, for reasons that I think are quite interesting, a lot of Russian statespeople kind of assumed that it was one thing, that it was kind of, everybody was a yamshchik, and a yamshchik was kind of a soslovia thing, it was kind of a special group. And actually, I think on the ground that was changing very fast, at least if you read the actual censuses of obligation relating to this thing. The question of the yamshchik more generally, non-singing yamshchik, I don't, of course, want to say that like every yamshchik was constantly singing. It's a performance. It's something that could or could not be picked up by literature folks. And so, for example, Pushkin used both. So like Pushkin has many famous lines where he kind of conjures singing coachmen. And there's one line, I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't remember it, but like, we all sing as one family from the yamshchik to the house, right? There are all kinds of people singing. Or like Однозвучно гремит колокольчик is partly based on a line by Pushkin where he talks about что-то слышится родное в долгих песнях ямщика, там удалое, to something. So either melancholy or adventure basically ends up being the line. So on the one hand, he does it, but for example, in Biesy, where everybody's lost and there's that horrible mitiel, the coachman is not singing. He's got, and I think that has to do a little bit with kind of the mordant, sort of murky atmosphere of Biesy, where it's you know, in some ways, to fall back on Hodges and Lotman a little bit. In some ways, on the one hand, the function of these poems is to indicate motion from, you know, freedom from obligation to freedom. But it seems like in Biesy, it's partly we're all stuck, and it's sort of hellish landscape. I think the lack of a song is indicative there in various ways. How it evolves across the 19th century, people keep resetting these songs. So I played for you Verstovsky's setting, which is a very bouncy kind of vaudeville setting of the song, but probably most people would know Vomchitsa Troika Udalaya as a very kind of, in a setting by the French-Russian composer Dubuc, who, and it's a kind of very balalaika piano, so Vomchitsa Troika Udalaya, you know, it's a very kind of rolling, kind of slow, melancholy song. And I think by then you really are getting sort of almost populist sentiments projected on this in a way that actually aren't, I think, really characteristic of the vaudeville performances of the early 1820s. So I think it does evolve over time. Oh, sorry, maybe I'm taking too long. And one last thing, just really quickly about Lvov, Yamshchiki na Podstavie. It's a wonderful opera. I have it here. I'd love to talk about it. But one thing that's interesting about Lvov, it was performed once, booed off the stage, and basically excluded from the imperial repertoire until it was rediscovered by Soviet researchers in the 20th century. So on the one hand, it's kind of known, and of course, Lvov is known for his interest in folk songs, but I would say that it's characteristic of kind of folky notions of this performance of relay coachmen in sort of late 18th century travel literature, but it's actually very distinct, I think, from from what becomes the genre of iamshchitskaia pesn'ia.
Very quickly, the opera actually is based on home production in Lvov's house, and these probably these productions spread and were popular. So, but we can talk about that.
Okay.
Okay, so we have a question from Ernest Zitzer. Following up on Olga Maiorova's comments about the symbolism of the Russian postal service, can you say something about the gendered nature of the performance? If early inscriptions on bell skirts are about buying and selling a product, is hiring the services of this masculine service class being equated with the services provided by lower class female prostitutes? Does it have anything to do with these men's association with entertainment and their work with draft animals who give rides to paying clients?
I think it's a complicated question, but I think, certainly there are discursive indications of that. So like, for example, in A Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow, one of the more nightmarish scenes of all of that is at Vyshny Volochyok, where the traveler arrives and these women run out to sell bulachki, little bublikia, right? And it's clear to Radishev that they are syphilitic, and that it's not just bubliki that are on sale, but also their bodies. So the idea that like the stations are, this is kind of a Rousseauian conception, are places of corruption as well as places of service, is like right in there. And there are of course testimonies about going to the stations as a site of prostitution at various points. I don't know how exactly that relates to this performance. I mean, I think it could, but it's part of the discourse, but I haven't quite worked out exactly if and how that works here. In terms of like the bell being called, the edge of the bell being called a yupka, I guess I'm wondering if that does femininely inflect it. I guess it would, but I don't know. I have to kind of think about that as a sort of technical term. But yeah, I mean, I think, in an age where freedom is valorized, service is seen as potentially corrupting and also potentially subordinate. And so, that is an enduring question. And well, for example, one way it's interesting. So on the one hand, the service class version of a yamshchik is that they've got a beard and that they like are kind of masculine patriarchal men. But you actually see in the poetry and in the pictures, they're typically presented as beardless youths. And the yamshchik is often called ditina, like a child of the people, right? And so there are kind of also hierarchical relationships that are imagined there.
Thank you, John, for this wonderful talk. And I have all sorts of things running around in my mind. But one of the things that occurred to me is, of course, is that yamshchiki are not the only people who sing in Russia. And I wondered if that reflects the fact that the people who are writing the songs this is their contact with, quote, the people, right, is on these coaches, rather than highlighting the songs of the women in their sewing circles, or the songs from the fields. And as I'm discovering in my own work, there's this vast information about Russian song and folk song in particular. So I wondered if you could sort of reflect on that a little bit more. Is this a sort of projection of consumer society of what the people are really like? And the other thing that kept running into my head was that when you talked about the figure of the yamshchik being, sort of covering vast distances and loneliness and all of this kind of stuff, is this the Russian version of a cowboy? Is it the same kind of figure? Obviously, the cowboy comes later, but is it the idea that somehow being out there in the open spaces makes these people fascinating? So I'll just stop there, but thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, a lot of things are coming together to make this tradition. I think, there is this sort of ethnographic developments in the late 18th and early 19th century where people are trying to look for folk poetry, representatives of the Russian spirit. This is the sort of pursuit of that is one thing that's going on. It's also, Romanticism is also a time when, it's not just like the coachman song is the only such genre, in the sense that like there are lots of genres. So like if you look at the pesn'ia of the time, there'll be songs like the song of the soldier, or like the song of, even in Russian, they'll have like the song of the gondolier, or the rhyme of the ancient mariner. There are lots of sort of texts that are imagined, which are people singing out in roles of different kinds of people, but laborers predominantly. And but I think on the one hand, I would kind of gesture to those other performances as things we could investigate, sort of how those performances get mediated. But I also think that, like you said, that for various probably contingent reasons, attention gets focused in an enduring way on this figure. And I'm not obviously saying this is the only like Russian national cliche or anything like that, but just I'm interested in how do you get a tradition that gets born in the 1820s and sort of keeps on going and kind of has this resonance. And I think that one contingency is people are looking for the popular spirit. Another contingency is they're interested in kind of these melodramatic themes. I think another contingency is that they are writing in these coachmen. That's where they meet them. It's like the ethnography of talking to your taxi driver, that's the kind of classic scholarly method. I think there's also the question of, why certain sorts of forms get advanced as being suitable for salon performance and why others don't. That's another question, right? Why, for example, it is, I think, later on you get folklore ensembles that are trying to perform, the uncorrupted songs of the Russian North and peasantry, but maybe not so much in the 1820s.
If I could just add to this, it seems to me that the women pose a problem in the sense that talk about unfree labor. And it's not a question that anybody wants to discuss, which is why I think their songs tend to be shunted off to the side to fit into what it is that you're trying to talk about as a part of this theater of obligation.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, John. This was really fantastic things coming all coming together from all of these different areas. And the thing that, sorry, this is a very minor question that I have, but the thing that came to mind as I was listening to you immediately was the concluding scene, or the concluding, I guess you could call it a scene of Utro Pomeshchika. I'm not sure if you remember this, but there is a fantastic moment when, fantastic for your project, I think, when Nekhludov Nekhludov's idea with he visits these different serfs that he has, and the last one whom he visits are these Dutlovs, who are who are wealthy and with whom he wants to enter into a kind of contract. He wants to buy a forest, half and half, I think. But what the sons do is, so the father refuses to enter into a contract, but what the sons do is they work as iamshchiki during certain seasons of the year. And Ilyushka in particular, one of these iamshchiki, is somebody with whom Nekhludov ends up ultimately identifying. So Nekhludov, so the last scene of the piece is Nekhludov is sitting at the piano and kind of fantasizing and making music in this kind of spontaneous way, thinking about the unsuccessful day that he has had and imagining himself, putting himself in the position of Ilyushka who is riding through, I sort of found this, some of this stuff, right? So he with Илюшка свободно и легко летит все дальше и дальше и видит внизу золотые города, облитые ярким сиянием, и синее небо с частыми звездами, и синее море с белыми парусами, и ему сладко и весело лететь все дальше и дальше. Славно шепчет себе Нехлюдов, и мысль, зачем он не Илюшка, тоже приходит ему в голову. So there is this a number of things that come together here, beginning with economic relationships that are complicated, right? Serfdom, business together, and iamshchitskaia, and ending with the introduction of music and flight and freedom and the road, right? And Tolstoy's fascination with the chronotope of the road, and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to make sure that to bring it to your attention as a possible place to look, and just kind of wondering about what you I feel like what you've said gives us such a kind of a much deeper way to read this passage now than we used to have prior to this moment. So thank you. Again, not quite a question.
Thank you. I mean, the one thing I would also say, just because this reminded me of it, is that, as I understand it, and be curious, obviously if I'm mistaken, but before the 19th century, so in the 18th century, 17th century, 16th century, when we talk about iamshchik, we really are talking about people who are driving these relays. So it's a relay coachman. In the 19th century, and interestingly, the word iamshchik begins a more definitive kind of morphing into being kind of a synonym for izvozchik at a certain point. Say, I don't know exactly where, I can't exactly plot exactly when, but like there's a point at which iamshchik, izvozchik are the same. Earlier, they're not. Izvozchik is very much like long-term drivers who are indeed hired to drive things, right? And iamshchik is the person who's serving the relay. And so like you talk about Nechlyudov and people hiring themselves out as iamshchiki, that it seems to me that kind of plays on that muddle where, state service, commercial service, hire, fee, all that stuff is being played out.
Okay, so John, thanks very much for a very stimulating paper. You were like a yamshchik. You're dashing across disciplinary spaces, singing no less. But I have a question which I think comes back to a sort of broader goal, that is what is distinctive about the 19th century. And I'm wondering if you could kind of restate that. But it seems to me that what's going on is a kind of gradual relinquishing of the state of various obligations and services and requirements and so on into, let's say, kind of a private sphere, whether it's economic labor markets, whether it's the consumer culture, or in the, I suppose in the area that I'm the most familiar with, the kind of civil society, where more and more it's groups of the population which are kind of taking over things that the state used to do. And this is still a very contested terrain. The state is relinquishing some things, but it's not completely stepping out. So I'm wondering if you could kind of rephrase or summarize what it is exactly that makes the 19th century unique in your work here. And is what I've said, is this similar to what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously nothing is ever totally unique, right? But I think, or rarely, but what I would say is, again, approaching this group, trying to think like, what is there something 19th century about the Russian Empire? Like on a basic functional level, like how it works. Is there something that's 19th century that I can think of as particularly curious? And, I think it does seem to me that the kind of persistent attempts across the century to kind of reposition imperial service or to offload it onto different sectors in a way that aren't necessarily based on the wide number of specific deals or special deals to individual populations such as iamshchitskaia, but to place it onto a larger base or perhaps place it onto a commercial base. I think that is something. So like, for example, in the early 18th century, Peter the Great actually investigated. He said one of the charges he gave to his spy, Henrik Fick, was to figure out how posts are done in other countries. And Fick reported to him that posts are done commercially in other countries. And Peter said, well, that's interesting. But ultimately he decided not to do that. And he actually doubled down on the expansion of the Soslovia of iamshchitskaia as it existed at that time. And then in the early 19th century, similar kind of question is being raised at the Imperial Council. But by then, I think there are a couple different processes that are quite important. One is the fact that a number of people in government and in society think that actually it would be better, it would be more enlightened if you could offload some of these things onto, we could reposition them within financial markets, or reposition them as services that are borne, for example, by people who do it on a contract basis. And this includes things like, the running of stations, the running of posts, the running of horse provision, the running of tax collection, the use of farmed out monopolies to run different kinds of things on a supposedly commercial basis is a thing. So on the one hand, you get people who are more interested in that. It's not a dominant or only point of view. And we can see that in 1861, which is, a big, huge discussion over, essentially how do we transform and yet in some ways also reposition and reinscribe peasant duties in the empire. And then on the other hand, I do think that within the social history of the period, we can see the ways in which the need for imperial services is racing beyond the culture of separate deals. That in some ways, there are more complicated things that they want to accomplish. There are bigger networks, there are bigger things than they can do maybe through a managed Soslovia system. I mean, this is not new in social history. We talk a lot about the kind of contested evolution from a society of states to a society of classes. And I don't know if I would exactly agree in that formulation, but I think that is something distinctive of the 19th century. And, that's a bit, obviously speculative. I have to ground that in a bigger essay, but it just as a theme, if we're going to talk about conversation, I think that's certainly one that I think is important, especially because in the end, what often happens, like people like Kluchevsky like to build their narratives of Russian history around a vision of the emancipation of Russian society, the sort of phrase "раскрепощение русского общества," right? And that implies an emancipation, which is one way of thinking about it. But there are also many ways in which it's not just a state of obligation and then all of a sudden a state of freedom, right? As you well know, and everybody here well knows, it's often a kind of reformulation, reposition of hierarchy within different kinds of systems. So the emancipation, for example, of the peasants, famously, of course, is a reworking of their obligation in financial terms in many respects. And yes, there are aspects of landlord authority which retreat, but there are other things that get kind of reasserted. So anyway, I think that theme, that's why I would maybe not think of the 19th century as the century of liberation so much as a century of transformation of obligations. And it is still an empire, so they still want to have inequality and hierarchy, even if this committee kind of briefly talks about equalizing measures. But anyway, that's what I would say, Brad, but obviously your work talks a lot about this in different ways, so I just sort of bring it up as a point of conversation.
All right, so thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I learned a lot from it. I have kind of a set of unstructured comments and questions, so I hope something can be made out of that. But I was thinking about the question of what is unique about the 19th century, and your talk made me think about the element of performance and presentation, right? So I guess I have a question about, and maybe this will help you think about, how to go in new directions. But my question is about publics and audiences, right? Who's listening to the songs and which versions of the songs, right? Is it the salon song that's being performed? The versions written by Glinka and others. Is it the actual Coachman songs? Who is listening and in what context and why? And also the images you brought up, right? The lithographic images. Those I've actually had some contact with myself, right? So who is looking at these images in the expanding periodical press of the 1820s, right? It's not accidental that they're coming out in the 1820s, these images. Part of it is the technological aspect that lithography is now available, and it is meant to be a popular medium, but in my own work in press history, I've come across many of these images, and also literary descriptions in the periodical press. I do a lot of work with Fede Bulgarin and Severine Pchela. So he was writing about various labors, right? This is the moment when the feuilleton and the sort of physiological sketch becomes popular. And so there were quite a lot of descriptions of labors, and obviously the Coachman also got a kind of Bulgarian-esque treatment there. And I think, to the question of what is the social role of this theater of obligation, this theater of performance, yes, there is this turn in the 1820s to looking for popular songs, popular images, representations of the narod, looking for that narodnost. But you also mentioned that, it's kind of like the contact that, almost like a taxi driver, right? You come into contact with them more often. And the proliferation of songs and images of Coachmen, I think, also speaks to the fact that more and more people are coming into contact with these kinds of figures, right? There's more transportation services. I mean, there's handbooks being printed about roads and pocketbooks, atlases about how to travel around the Russian Empire and so on. So this dimension of transportation and getting around more and just being in contact with the Coachman makes its way into popular culture in the printed media, in the periodical press, and in the songs. Sorry, I'm taking up a lot of time, but I just wanted to put that out there. As a question of audiences and publics and who's reading and who's listening. The uniqueness about the 19th century in terms of performance, right? For new publics, for new audiences. So I thank you for that.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think I should talk to you about who's reading. It sounds like I would love to. I think, so just on a very basic question, my understanding based on what I've read is, at least in the first half of the 19th century, I don't think there's much of a crossover between the kind of repertoire that Coachmen are singing while they're driving, which I think is really this Ruskaya pesn'ia. And you can actually, in that song, in that poet text, that's actually embedded. So like Zачем вы люди злые, that's like a classic, melodramatic Russian pesn'ia song. And I don't think that like Vomchitsa Troika Udalaya is being performed by a iamshchik. Like that, I think that is something that is passed on to salon culture and actually is ultimately ending up at Josephine Clark's house in Brighton in England, right? So I think that there are different ways in which these things are circulating. But I have to admit that other than like broad notions of audience, I haven't done enough research yet on thinking about kind of the kind of sort of really charting out exactly where these songs go in different ways. And for example, so the trajectory, however, of the songs that Coachmen sang, so like in the late 1830s, Ivan Kiraevsky produces a volume of folk songs. And he includes in that collection a number of songs that he wrote down from his iamshchik. And so this is his, so like he is viewing that as an ethnographic resource. And you know, Kiraevsky's at that time, Kiraevsky would probably be somewhat horrified by iamshchitskaia pesn'ia as like an arty genre. And actually he was looking for the real thing for reasons. And like, so he was writing it down. So in some ways, and then this leads to the kind of longer term ethnographic controversy around the nature of the Russkaya pesn'ia and whether it's actually narodnaya pesn'ia, which is a whole kind of conversation, right? So anyway, that's maybe what I would say about that. And yes, your point is very well taken about sort of people being in contact. And I think that feeds the performative genre in some ways, that, you know, if and as civilians begin to travel on this system and coachmen understand their performances as being part of their service in a kind of commercial way as well as like an imperial way, then, you know, I think these are kind of feedback loops a little bit. But I would love to hear more about your research on these things, because I need to think more about that.
Okay, thank you, Sasha. Thank you very much, John, for that very interesting talk. I'm going to ask you something about performance from a slightly different point of view, which has to do with the history. The history of Tosca interests me a lot, and it seems to me that a lot of what these coachmen are performing is Tosca, and there's a kind of a stereotype of coachmen being Tuscalivia that I think starts probably in the late 1700s and goes up until, you know, coaches are no more. And there's also an idea of peasant song being particularly Tosca ridden. And I don't know much about peasant song, but I absolutely, in the literary representations of what peasants do, what emotions they feel, they represent Tosca. And there's something about the iamshchik driving the elite writer who's going to then describe this through the Russian landscape that imbues all of it with Tosca. The peasants are full of Tosca. They reek of Tosca, and therefore the Russian landscape is full of Tosca, as we know. But somehow this has to be invented as a characterization of the Russian landscape. I mean, it's not there in the middle of the 1700s that the landscape somehow produces Tosca. And I don't know if in you're looking at, you know, art songs or folk songs, or if you see any evolution or the appearance from somewhere or from nothing of Tosca, or its crescendo in Kiraevsky, or I think in Russian literature, there's a little bit of it in Tosca, there's in Pushkin, there's a little bit of it in Gogol. The poems of Nekrasov are absolutely thick with peasants that are talking about Tosca, various peasant narrators or peasant figures. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, so it's a really fascinating question, and I would agree with you. I mean, the repertoire that develops is you know, dominated by themes of longing and desire and melancholy on some level. And I was just, it's actually in Domik v Kalamnia is the one by Pushkin. And actually, I think the phrase is "Мы всё поем уныло." So I wish I could find it. I'll find it here in a second. Maybe I will. But like that is part of the that is definitely part of the genre. You know, where does that come from? I will go ahead and relate that to this whole question of the relationship of duty and desire, and the need to kind of engage and rethink that relationship. So like on the one hand, in romantic philosophy, that's a huge question, you know, the kind of the agonistic nature of the self, the way in which, you know, like in Fichte, for example, we learn through constantly being checked in our desires, and life is constantly a process by which we try to do something and then we can't really do it, and that kind of makes us who we are. And That's a broad philosophical context, but then I also think that in the 19th century, this is a political / cultural / thematic theme of kind of what is, what is it to be in an obligated state, and is that reconcilable with one's own aspirations or to one's own progress, or to what one wants to be. So I think for me, Tuska, if I were to be asked, I would say it's the conflict between duty and desire that is kind of as kind of a theme that is coming together in many respects. And I see this in, a lot of the Ruskaya pesn'ia is predominantly a melodramatic form focused on exactly what happens when Dobry Molodets finds himself frustrated by люди злые, or not the Dobry Molodets, but also his девица, so it's the male genre, but like, conflicted desires, how he's ending up someplace that he doesn't want to be, that is far away from his home. These are, that nexus of themes, I think, comes forward in part for aesthetic, in part for, I would argue, cultural reasons, political reasons, and in part for generic conventions. I mean, one of the things that I think is really interesting is what is the attraction, if you are a writing and a coach, what is the attraction of your coachman singing a song about his desperate heartbreak and the fact that he wants to be home, right? Like, and sort of, I mean, it's the blues on some level, right? And you can also think of it as kind of an appropriation, perhaps, on some level, of like these kind of elected affinities, these kind of like, on the one hand we're similar, on the other hand we're different. So I think that's just a very complicated cultural moment that I'm, again, still trying to think through, but I think your question points exactly at it. Now it should be said, there are coachmen, so iamshchitskaia pesn'ia, there are joyful ones. Vdolь Papitrovskoy is one such, which is kind of about the joy of bouncing along the Petersburg highway. There are some fast ones, which I would think would take from kind of peasant dance songs, pesn'ia, those kind of хороводы, that kind of thing. But most of them are more in the long cadences, the periodization pesn'ia, which is sort of in some ways a more melancholic genre. I don't know if that answers your question, but those are some thoughts that would spring to mind from it.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for a really interesting and enjoyable paper. I'm trying to get my head around the real existing coachman rather than the image of the coachman. And so I'm wondering whether we know anything, well, whether we know to what extent real iamshchiki consciously took part in this 19th century discussion about obligation and bondage. Did they sing about that? Do we have the repertoire of some iamshchiki? You referred to the Kirievsky collection just now. I don't know what these songs are. I'm asking this also because I've looked at some folklore collections where the songs the peasants sing are actually not at all what I expected, because they're not about Tuska and they're actually quite joyful, and it's all about women cheating on their husbands and having a great time. So I guess I'm asking, what do we know about real coachmen, or is this maybe about the image of the coachman that you're describing?
Complex question. I mean, to resolve archivally, but I do think so. All the testimonies that we have, where people wrote down a song, they said, "My coachman sang this song." All those testimonies that I've been able to discover, so from Kirievsky's collection, from kind of folkloric collections, pesn'iki of the early 19th century, from like travelers' literature. Again, this is not a scripted responsibility, so it doesn't so much appear in like the Polное собрание законов, but like, all the sources that I've been able to see, it ends up being, melodramatic songs of love, these kind of Ruskaya pesn'ia. What it ends up not being, like, for example, there was that quote that I showed, which said, "Быт ямщиков породил лирические pesn'ia." And, if you read like some Soviet scholarship on this subject, you'll get the sense that the songs are kind of primitive rebel songs where like they're singing about what it's really like to be a coachman, right? Or they're singing about, you know, scenes from their daily life. And I haven't seen any evidence of people recording that kind of song was what they sang, nor have I seen evidence that it's what we might think of as classical folk song, like peasant song. I mean, I'm sure that happened, but like as a genre that people wrote down and said like, these are the kinds of songs the coachmen were singing, not so much. And I guess that's one of the reasons I think of it as a more of a performative genre, in the sense that I'm not sure that the people who were serving the post as coachmen were out to, in those songs, express their authentic state of mind or culture. I mean, in part because, I mean, this is again the kind of tricky question, but like in part because the iamshchitskaia is a role. Like I think we want to think of it as like a stable social caste, but oftentimes people wanted to run away from being a iamshchik. They didn't want to be an obligated relay coachman because it was really hard work and your horse could break down and you would rather be plowing, or you'd rather be a member of the Passad and be trading like there. And so actually there is a kind of constant dialogue in late 18th, early 19th century life about, is it possible to create a stable saslovia of iamshchikia? Or is that itself kind of an illusion? And is what actually happening is people are nanimayut vmeste себя, you know, they hire instead of themselves the duty of doing this thing. And then, you know, from different groups, rural groups, Passad groups. And then the question is, when they sing, you know, it's again, that I think from my point of view, that complicates the idea that this is all coming from Brit, because like it's, there isn't necessarily a stable Brit of this Saslovia, right? There are different people stepping into this role. And, you know, some people are doing it, as it were, involuntarily, and some people are doing it in the place of people who are involuntarily obliged, right? So like that is another complicating factor. So, you know, I guess I think that there's all the evidence I've seen implies a kind of repertoire of songs that you would sing or could sing, kind of generic repertoire of songs that you could sing if you're performing this duty in this way, and if you're kind of thinking of yourself as stepping into the role of iamshchik. But in terms of like the saslovia itself, it was very complicated at that point. And the other thing, of course, was already mentioned earlier in the talk, like different groups are doing it in different ways. So like on the Duneberg Road, they, you know, it's explicitly not a saslovia, it's a group, but then they're trying to figure out how to perform imperial relay service in that empire. You know, I don't know. And the other thing is, I should say, I don't know, like, I don't have testimonies, for example, of how like yasak bearers, yasashniya ludzie, how they performed this role. So in many ways, I am also talking about kind of the old Muscovy within the new empire, and kind of that area more than like where relay services in different other parts of the empire. I don't know if that answers your question, Julia, but like those are some of the things I think about when I think about what is sometimes published as folk song in the Russian Empire.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, so much. Thank you especially to John for that fantastic talk.
Thank you.
And to Olga for the remarks, wonderful remarks. And it was so good to see everybody, and we will see you again soon. Thank you, John, for reopening 19V seminar series.
Thank you all so much. It's really an honor and a privilege. I'm very grateful to you.
Great. We'll see you soon. Bye.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you so much.